It goes without saying that thieves in the early game are very good. However, when you enter the mid to latter half of the game, how well do they fare? Though I think their overall power and usefulness does decrease a little bit as you enter the latter half of the game, there are still very good uses for them. In this video, I have a team composition that utilizes, I think, the two best ways you can use a rogue, one being support and one being damage. Let's get started. So, taking a look at the team composition, you'll see that we're using 2 rogues, a Viking, an Elven Archer, and a Werewolf. The objective of this unit is to strip down the front line and get things low enough for the Werewolf to clean up the entire enemy unit. The rogue does have a lot of attack utility in Shadow Bite and Toxic Throw. The 2 rogue builds I'm going to show you right now do not include those. The 2 skills that I want to focus on in this video are Active Steal and Passive Steal. So the most important thing to make sure your rogues are useful is to put them in a squad that can guard break. If the enemy can guard a rogue's attacks, the rogue's usefulness drops immensely. So starting off with the first rogue, this is what I think a lot of rogue builds will end up being, which is more on the support side. The objective of this rogue is to steal action points as well as passive points to boost the items that the rogue carries. In this case, we're using the Thief spell to provide evasion for the Viking and the rogue behind him, as well as Dancer's Bracelet to buff up the Werewolf so he has an easier time executing units. You'll see that this rogue does pretty much no damage, but the utility he provides with Powerful Call and Grant Evade, as well as taking away important action points that could activate more dangerous abilities on certain characters, makes this rogue still very useful in this composition. Of course, having a very high evasion stat also helps immensely because evasion tanking is still quite good in this game. Now I say most rogues are going to be on the support side because I think the damage rogue you can really only make one of because it utilizes an item that you only get one of. So moving on to the other rogue, Travis, he is geared more towards actually dealing damage. He is the other big damage dealer in this unit, and he really helps soften enemies for the Werewolf to sweep in and get it with his follow-up attack. So looking at this rogue's equipment, you'll see that we're using the Master's Gauntlets. This is kind of what makes this rogue actually able to deal a lot of damage. If you do not know what the Master's Gauntlets do, it provides the wearer the skill Nimble Fighter, which is a 1 passive point cost after an evade. It grants the user 20% increased physical attack as well as 30% critical damage, and this stacks. So you put this on a rogue with super high evasion. As you can see, we're using Nato's Sword for an extra action point, as well as the initiative and evasion, as well as a Royal Scarf and Lucky Coin to increase our crit rate so we can utilize that crit damage stack even more, and we've got ourselves a recipe for a ton of damage. If we move along to his tactics, we'll see that we prioritize Passive Steal first because I do want him to get as many passive points as possible, so when he gets attacked, he can always proc Nimble Fighter and hit that damage cap really quickly. Afterward, I like to use Active Steal next, just so he gets another attack, and again, stealing action points from your enemy is very useful. And then lastly, he'll use Passive Steal again, just on if any unit has passive points, he'll target that. There's nothing too complicated about either of these builds, which is nice, but that doesn't mean they don't perform their job super well. If we move on to the supporting units, you'll really see how this all comes into play. So in the back line, we'll start with the Viking. Taking a look at his equipment, we've got a Vorpal Axe, Azure Crest Shield, Raven Plume, and Sniper's Lens. We have the Vorpal Axe and Raven Plume to try and get his initiative higher than the other rogues. Right now he's only higher than the support rogue, which is a little tough, but it's really hard to beat an initiative of 55. And having him go as soon as possible to use Wide Breaker or Rolling Axe to decrease the defense of whatever frontline units we're attacking is still very important. And making sure that we have the defense down before the Werewolf attacks is extremely important. We use the Sniper's Lens to guarantee that we're going to land that first attack, because a lot of the time we are still going to run into evasion tanks in the front, so he's also a good answer to initial hits before the Werewolf has a chance to act. Because Widebreaker costs 2 action points, I only want to make sure he uses that with rows of 3+ combatants. Otherwise, I like the action economy of Rolling Axe and being able to use that twice with 2+ combatants, and if it's just a single enemy left, he will just result in using Smash. Again, it's a very straightforward build, not a lot of conditions you need to add to these tactics, and that's kind of the nice thing about Vikings, is their kit is very straightforward to build. Moving on to the Elven Archer, she's kind of the biggest support unit in terms of healing and providing crowd control in the backline, and her equipment is also fairly straightforward. A dove plume to make sure that she's going quickly, or at least faster than the other enemies, ideally before the enemy backline is able to act. I want to use a carnelian pendant, so I have 3 action points, so I can use an icicle arrow initially, and then use magic conferral on our big carry on the werewolf, and I'll explain the first aid kit in just a second when we get into the tactics. I don't have any special bows, we just use the great wood bow, as I do want to mix a physical attack and magical attack. I'm not really looking for her to do damage, as I am just freeze the enemies in the backline. I do end up using every single tactic on her kit, as I do want her to perform very specific things. You'll see I have 2 icicle arrows set up, and that's because I want to make sure that we're prioritizing archers who have eagle eye. That's kind of the biggest crux of this team, is if they've got true strike, then we're in big trouble. So I want to make sure that she's going faster than most archers that have eagle eye, and she primarily wants to freeze those so I don't have to worry about my rogues getting hit with 2 strikes. So if there's no enemies in the back row, she will go ahead and just move to the front row, and we want to prioritize anyone with the most amount of action points, as if we can freeze them, I can then use my rogues to steal the action points of that frozen enemy so they don't really get to go at all. After she performs her icicle arrow, a lot of the time I just want her to use mystic conferral, and you'll see why. Even though she uses it on the second turn, there's still a lot of benefit from giving the extra magic damage to the werewolf, because you'll see that the werewolf doesn't constantly use a lot of his actions on the first turn. If for some reason I have extra action points, I still just have wind arrow tactics on there, but they can most likely be removed if this is too cluttered for you. After that, we kind of get into the reason why I have that first aid kit, and that's because a lot of the time I'm not using her passive points, and if she has her 2 passive points at the end of a round, she'll go ahead and use first aid on herself, which will actually proc selfless heal. So when I run into assist attacks, that's mainly what this is used for, is I can take that assist attack, and then at the end of combat, she can go ahead and AoE heal, and it's like it never happened. Of course, if we do encounter debuffs, I still have her use Quick Cure, especially if we get inflicted with blindness as we head into Albion. I'd rather her cure the blindness than run the risk of wasting all my passive points on a heal that does nothing. And then last but not least, our ace in the hole, that kind of goes with our rogues as a seal the deal of the unit, is the werewolf. In my past run, I was struggling to figure out where I could place him, and he works really well in this comp with the 2 rogues actually. If we take a look at his equipment, we are trying to make him go moderately fast with the Vorpal Sword, as increased initiative is never a bad thing. I have the Thief's Mantle on him to evade attacks that might hit a column or a row, as well as a Lionheart to increase his physical attack, give him some extra crit, as well as that additional accuracy is very important. And then last but not least, I actually have him on a Sapphire Pendant to max out his passive points. You'll see that I'm not really focusing on his action point economy. That's actually secondary to this build, because you'll see I want the passive points for those extra evade chances, as well as he can gain a lot of action points from his Killing Pursuit skill. So moving on to his tactics, you'll see that he does a lot of waiting. I do not want him to act immediately. I want him to act when he's more guaranteed to get action points off of his Killing Pursuit, or can get increased attack damage by finishing off a kill that the rogue or Viking sets up. So to start, we have Wildfang at the top. I want it to be used with at least 2 or more combatants, and I want those combatants to be around 50% or less HP, as most of the werewolf's skills really benefit when either an enemy is singled out, or there's less enemies, or the enemies don't have a ton of HP. Next, I have him use Decimate if there are 2 or fewer enemies, as this is his more execute skill, and I really want to get the most potency out of this move, so I don't want him to use it until we hit that point. So the skill that the werewolf ends up using the most is Finishing Stab, and that's mainly because I want him to get that 50% increased physical attack after he defeats a target. Now looking at the text, it doesn't say that the effect stacks, but that doesn't mean that I don't want that effect to keep proccing on his future attacks. And then of course, if he's just lying in wait and there are no targets for him to hit, once a target hits 0 action points, that's when I just let him go crazy, as I don't want him to sit on standby for too long or not use any of his attacks in the first place. After that, we have Evade. His evasion is okay, so I found that putting evasion equipment on him wasn't that fantastic, and I'd rather just add the Thief's Mantle to that, as well as the additional passive points, because those 2 pieces of equipment help him much more than 2 evasion pieces would. And that's because he's not always going to be hit with a column attack, so having the ability to just have the maximum amount of passive points possible really helps him with Killing Pursuit, as Killing Pursuit is fantastic for when a target gets super low and he's able to finish them off, as that's how you can get those additional action points to keep dealing additional damage. And to top it all off, I still have him use Bestial Howl, as that is additional physical attack on him and the Viking. The Werewolf is such a unique unit, it can really get out of control if he's able to stack up enough. So I highly recommend you mess around with them, and hopefully these tactics can help inspire you to find other team compositions that he could fit into. I think this unit composition really highlights the positives of the rogues and the utility that they can provide or the damage that they can deal. They are still very solid evasion tanks, but once you get the Werefox, you kind of have to decide whether you want more utility or more damage. And in my previous playthrough, I found I wanted to use Werefoxes more than I did rogues. So after revisiting them, I think these are the two best ways that you can use a rogue. Of course, I don't want to discount Toxic Throw or Shadow Bite, but I just found that the blindness on Shadow Bite was being eaten up by follow-up attacks, and it wasn't really getting the biggest bang that I thought it would. So after doing some tinkering, I just found that Active Steel and Passive Steel are fantastic against frontline units and really capitalize on the other ways that you can use a rogue because of how many passive points that they get, the few extra active points that they can get, and of course the power that the Master's Gauntlets can give to an evasion tank. Of course, at the end of the day, I'm just hoping that these unit compositions and tactics give you more inspiration on how you can spice up your team compositions and get overall more enjoyment out of the game. But that is going to do it for me on this video. If you happen to make it this far, thank you very much for watching, I do appreciate it. And if you're interested to see what else I end up doing on this channel, please consider subscribing. Thank you for watching.